In this slide, we will discuss the importance of retrieving application properties from a config server in different folders on GitHub. One common practice in microservice architecture is to store application properties in a centralized configuration server. GitHub can be used as a config server by leveraging different folders to store different configurations. Retrieving these application properties from the config server in different folders is a crucial step in the configuration process. The config server can be accessed by the microservice through a config client, typically implemented using Spring Boot. This allows each microservice to access its relevant application properties and customize its behavior accordingly. To set up a config server in a different folder on GitHub, you need to follow these steps. First, create a new repository on GitHub to store your configuration files. Then, create a new folder in the repository to store the configuration files for the config server. Next, add your configuration files to the new folder. Make sure the configuration files have the correct format and naming conventions required by Spring Cloud Config. Finally, commit and push the configuration files to the repository on GitHub. The following is a sample configuration file for the config server which specifies the URI of the GitHub repository and the search path for the folder that contains the configuration files. To integrate the config server with a microservice using config client in Spring Boot, you need to follow these steps. First, add the Spring Cloud Config client dependency to your microservice's build file. Next, configure the connection details of the config server in the microservice's application, properties or application.yml file. Then, create a REST template bean in the microservice's configuration class to communicate with the config server. Finally, inject the values from the config server into your microservice's components using the @value annotation. To integrate the config server with a microservice using config client in Spring Boot, you will need to use the @value annotation to inject the values from the config server into your microservice. Here's an example of how to do this in a Spring Boot application. First, import the necessary dependencies and annotate your main class with @Spring Boot application and @REST controller. Next, use the @value annotation to inject the property value from the config server. Finally, define a REST endpoint to retrieve the property value and run the application using Spring application.run. To test and troubleshoot the retrieval of application properties from the config server, follow these steps. First, validate the configuration properties in the config server to ensure they are correct. Then, check the application's bootstrap.yml or application.yml file to confirm that it is correctly configured to connect to the config server. Next, verify that the application is using the correct profile to retrieve the properties from the config server. You can use the actuator endpoints provided by Spring Boot, such as config props or env, to check if the properties and their values are being retrieved correctly. Finally, inspect the logs of the application to see if there are any errors or warnings related to retrieving the properties from the config server. Here's an example of how to retrieve an application property from the config server using Spring Boot. In the app_config class, use the @value annotation to inject the value of the property with the key, property.key, into the property value variable. Make sure to replace property.key with the actual key of the property you want to retrieve. The rest of the code should be implemented as needed.